Hey guys, it's great to see you again. It's Ticket to Ride. I have no idea what episode this is, but I'm so happy to be here with Thaddeus Bouchard, the president and CEO of Screen Dollars, and Mike Polydorus, king of the world, and also president and CEO of Paper Airplane. Is it Paper Airplane Media or just Paper Airplane?
So that's a good segue, Paul. So we had just dawned on us. We are now in the 5th year of Paper Airplane. When we Thank you. When we originally named the company, it was just Paper Airplane, but that name had been taken somewhere, so we had to call it Paper Airplane Media. So the official name is Paper Airplane Media. However, we've kind of like that, so we've kind of added that. We are Paper Airplane Media is what we kind of call ourselves now. So it's funny that you bring that up. And, Paul and I were just kibitzing before we started. I'm in Kansas City this week. And as Paul, what did you say?
I said, if you're in this business, meaning theatrical, exhibition, studios, it can be studio side too. Yeah. When you say you're in Kansas City, everybody knows where you are, Mike, or what you're doing. So
you're at the barbecue. You're at the barbecue restaurant. That's where you are.
Well, I will be there later on tonight. But if I look out the window and tilt my head to the left, I see the AMC Theater Support Center, which is where we met with our friends from AMC earlier today. And it's just kind of giving a recap of what we've been doing over the last 5 years. And it was interesting because one of the tools we launched, the Hangar, which I know Thaddeus, you guys use on a regular basis, which houses all the studio assets. We are approaching 1.5 million downloads out of the Hangar.
You've got to do this, Mike. You've got to put your finger up here when you say 1.5 million, right?
1 million downloads.
I try to keep it very down low, but I'm very proud of what the team has accomplished and how they put that together. And, the Hangar has become an industry utility. We look at it as a vital part of the industry. Everybody, virtually every studio uses it. And we're thinking back to the first few days when we had it up and running. And this was in October of 20. We had a couple of movies in there and we were like, look, we got 8 downloads today. That's amazing. Now we're averaging somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 downloads.
Hey, Mike. Maybe our podcast will do that. We have 8 downloads this week.
Right.
In 5 years,
Point. Yes.
we'll have 1 million downloads.
1 million. That's right.
I love that. Anyway, so we were just here, as Paul said, when you're in, we're actually going to meet with Brock and the B&B team tomorrow. So
love that team.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. Yep. And so it's been a really, it's been a good trip, and it's a great partnership that the Paper Airplane team has with our friends over at AMC and with B&B and all of Exhibition, actually.
And Mike, I liked it when it was called The Paper Airplane, like the Facebook.
Yeah, no, we did the Facebook. That's funny. Paul, going back to our Ticket to Ride. So Thaddeus was in town last week with his cohort, John Shaw. We had dinner, and, the third amigo, Paul, blew us off.
Yeah, I had his teach at a class online.
He had to educate the kids. Someone's got to educate the kids, right? Yeah.
I missed out on the steak and bourbon or whatever you guys had. I'm very jealous.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
It was really it was a good night. And Thaddeus, thank you again for coming out. And I think
thanks for picking the restaurant, Mike.
It was great to get together.
Did you pick up the check?
I just picked up the check. That really nice. It's on us next time.
And John Shaw was there. I love John Shaw. I got to give him a shout out. He's
the great John Shaw.
He's probably the only person in this business, maybe my age or older. I don't know, but I love the guy.
John is an encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to film.
And stories. Knowledge and stories. Lots of stories. Yeah, over
good.
5 decades. Yeah, it's fun.
So I want to tell you guys a story, okay?
Yes.
Sure.
There once was a box office called 2025. And 3 weeks ago, it was really alive. And we were at 21% ahead in terms of the year-to-date box office. We expected that, given the headwinds that challenged the year of 24 in the first quarter. And we've had, and here on Ticket to Ride, we don't sugarcoat things. We give you the straight scoop while also keeping an eye on what the reality is, right? And then not to get carried away with negative narratives that are based on a sliver of time. And, over the Oscar weekend versus the same weekend a year before, that was down 50%. This past weekend was down 60% versus the same weekend a year ago when Kung Fu Panda 4 opened to $58 million, which was more than the entire weekend did this year with all films. So when you have that happen, you see that progressive downturn in the percentage advantage. Now we're pretty much going from 21%. Now we're pretty much even with last year. But fear not, help will be on the way. It always does. But guys, why don't we talk a little bit about how the roller coaster ride, and we saw that last year, we were down 27.5% before Inside Out 2 opened, and we knocked about 23.5 percentage points, somewhere around there, off that deficit by the time we got to the end of the year. So let's talk about the roller coaster that is the box office. Now, you can't get too scared because things in a month or in mid-May will be singing a very different tune.
I think very much.
Yeah, go ahead, Thaddeus.
Yeah, I think very much. I mean, we've been through it not just over the years, but over the last 12 months, over the last 18 months. You know, the beginning of last year was generally perceived to be a disaster in the making, you know, a disaster unfolding before our eyes. And then the second half of the year was incredibly strong and sort of brought our box office totals for the year back to, you know, beyond where anyone would have thought it would have been at halfway through the year. So these cycles, they just repeat again and again. It depends obviously on the product. It depends on the movies, what movies are in the marketplace and how they're resonating and you know, expect more of the same, basically, is what it comes down to, I think.
Yeah. I think you're 100% right. You know, Paul, a theme we beat into the ground last year, especially when things were on the downside, was it truly is a portfolio approach, meaning you can't look at the year, you know, week by week. You have to look at the year as a 52-week cycle. And, you know, we're in that down cycle right now. The last 3 weeks have not been great. This weekend looks like it's going to be more of the same. But fear not, as you said, Paul, help is on the way. Waiting in the wings is Snow White, which looks like it's a $50 to $60 million opener at least coming up following week. And then all of a sudden, you know, you have, you know, the release schedule kind of switches and, you know, there's more film on, you know, downwind that looks, you know, fairly promising.
That's right. And when you look at the upcoming weekend, you do have a couple of newcomers in there, and actually more than a few newcomers in there. But it's not going to be a blockbuster weekend, but there are great movies in the mix. And I always say, let's not conflate the box office with the quality of the movies or the experiences, the positive movie-going experiences. You can have a look at Last Breath. Great reviews, had a minimal drop-off. That's a win. You know, we fixate on how the weekend is doing versus the same weekend a year ago. Maybe we need to, in a way, I know we have to do that because we're in the business of data and analysis, but this isn't like we're not making widgets here. I always say these are movies, and it's an experiential and emotional component as well. And coming off of the Oscars, obviously, people were very fixated on movies and the movie-going experience. And Sean Baker is my new hero, the director of Anora. I heard stories of cinema operators around the world rejoicing in his comments that he made.
Well, it's really funny you say that. We actually at Paper Airplane received quite a few requests from independent cinema operators who basically said, do you have a DCP file of Sean Baker's speech so that we can put it up on screen? Which is pretty amazing. So, you know, it resonated with a lot of people.
That's
right. I was just going to pick up on the point of looking ahead on the release schedule. You know, we're talking about Snow White. You have, you know, coming up, you have Death of a Unicorn from A24, Woman in the Yard. You have A Working Man from MGM. Then you have, you know, what looks to be or could be a big movie from our friends at Warner Brothers on April 4th with Minecraft. Warfare from A24 on April, and The King of Kings from Angel, the animated faith-based movie, which looks good. And then, of course, Sinners on April 18th from our friends at Warner's. So as you lead into the summer season, which kicks off on May 2nd with Thunderbolts, there is a lot of, you know, April's going to be a pretty solid month, I think, you know, the end of March into April. So again, it's peaks and valleys. And when you look into summer, Paul, as you had mentioned before, summer looks really good. And again, the second half of the year, like it did last year, looks really solid.
Yeah, and I'm going to put up...
I want to go on a limb right now. I have my sleeper pick for 2025. Now, the movie, it opens the last week, but I think this is going to be one of the most talked about movies of the year. And I'll bet you at the end of the day, one of the highest grossing, Housemaid.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Yes, that's an under the radar film from our friends at Lionsgate. The book is gaining so much traction with book clubs and the cast and the director. I believe that this is going to be one of those at the end of the day, everybody's going to go, where did that come?
So how do you tap into that sort of trend line? Is that social media activity? Is that video activity online? What is that?
Organic of just being wherever. Now when you start hearing women who are probably, over 35 and they're all talking about the book they're reading and it's all Housemaid. So, you have Sydney Sweeney, you have Paul Feig as the director. When you put that all together, this is reminiscent of, and I know it's, at this point, it's got a lot of negative Nancy on it, but that was, It Ends With Us, the one with
Justin Baldoni and
Justin
Blake Lively. Wow. Have you been following that? We won't get into that here.
No, but what I'm saying is the movie went out and scored a big home run at the box office. Mm-hmm. And I believe that Housemaid is going to do very similar.
I'd like to put up I did a whole slide about the upcoming movies. Mike, you mentioned a few of them. If you can give me permission, Thaddeus, I'd like to share my screen just to show those who are viewing this rather than just listening the upcoming slate, because it really is impressive. And Mike, again, I've quoted you on this. I've stolen this idea from you many times about the portfolio approach. And again, I think it's just really, to distill it down, it's taking a broad view of the marketplace, not just looking at, a couple of weeks. If we were to look at a couple of weeks every year and determine how good the year was going to be, but you could say it's gloom and doom every year. There's always downtrending. And I think this episode should be called something like, the box office that is the roller coaster continues.
Well, but Thaddeus mentioned it right off the top, and that is, this is nothing that is, unique to this year or last year or even, post-COVID. We've had these peaks and valleys for as long as I've been in this business. And, I may have mentioned this before previously. I'll never forget when I was working in the theater years ago. And back then, Fox would have two tracks. They had the A track and the B track. I worked at the UA Westwood, and there was the GCC ABCO on Wilshire Boulevard, for anyone who's old like me and they remember that.
I've been there.
ABCO would always get the A track. We would get the B track. And they got what was perceived to be the big movie for the year, which was probably 79, 80, whatever it was. And it was I Ought to Be in Pictures, based on the Neil Simon play. And everybody had high hopes on that, following Goodbye Girl. Meanwhile, our little theater was stuck with this teen comedy called Porky's. At the end of the day, the B track of Porky's completely outgrows the A track by a lot. Meaning, at the end of the day, no one knows nothing when it comes to this.
Mike, I love that you bring that up. We should actually do some research, and even our listeners can too. There's many examples of that theater owners have. Buyers and bookers from back in the day said, oh, we got this, we got the B movie, whatever you call it, like the one that nobody wants.
I'll give you another one. 1977, the A track was a movie called The Other Side of Midnight.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
It was based on a novel. Do you know what the B track to The Other Side of Midnight was? A little movie called Star Wars.
How funny.
That's it.
Yeah, and it was, there were theater owners that were complaining they got stuck with the Star Wars track.
Right.
Still
Bummer.
complaining to this day, probably.
Right. And back then it took longer for these movies to play out, right? Whereas now, the sort of crescendo comes much more quickly because of probably streaming and just sort of attention spans in the modern world. But
it's interesting you bring that up, Thaddeus. I think the reason they play out quick, there's two reasons for that. Number one is there's just more screens now.
Right.
In other words, in the old days, and Paul, you remember this, like if you opened up, at the UA Westwood, there wasn't another screen. So when we sold our 550 seats, you had to wait till the next, showing before you could.
Yeah.
A 16-plex or an 18-plex, you will, it's not uncommon for 5 screens to be whatever that movie is that's cranking out the big gross. So you kind of burn through the gross a little bit quicker. And the other thing, and this will be distribution nerd talk, and that is recently, what used to be the clearances went away. And for those of you not in the industry, the clearance would be, if theater A on the street corner was playing it, theater B down the street couldn't play it, and vice versa. And so that actually enabled movies to play a lot longer. Now that you have the clearances are gone and theater A and theater B can play it, it just means it goes faster, and theaters and the turn on movies is much quicker in the multiplex. It has hurt the playability and the ability of a movie to be able to hang in there longer. To your point, streaming hasn't helped the issue, but it's more about out with the old, in with the new mentality. And, you just don't get to, kind of gestate the way you used to do. I mean, I remember, again, going back to my UA Westwood days, we'd had Prizzi's Honor in there for 23 weeks.
Right. Yeah. And, when you bring this up, it makes me think of movies that had huge budgets that went out in theaters and then killed other movies for the future. And it just came up because, Mike, what you were saying about The Other Side of Midnight, movies like that. And in 1970, so it sparked my brain cooking. In 1970, a movie called Waterloo with Rod Steiger and produced by Dino De Laurentiis. And, Kubrick, I have a huge book I have all these books of filmmakers, and Stanley Kubrick was going to make a Napoleon movie. And they're like, well, look at Waterloo, it bombed. We're not going to make your movie. Right. I mean, and that happens too. Even before Star Wars, people thought, we're not going to go all in on a sci-fi movie. Look at this other sci-fi movie that bombed. And so, like you said, Mike and Thaddeus, you just never know.
Well, that's the thing, is you can't predict what the audiences would like. Right. And a lot of times, you'll sit in back when I was working at Lionsgate, we would sit in the green light meeting and everybody would present their case as to, here's the script, here's the cast. And, you try to formalize it and say, it's going to do this versus that. And, one of our executives summed it up perfectly. We were talking about La La Land. And they were giving all the reasons to make it, not make it. And at the end of the day, this person, who I will not name, but will know who it is once he'll know who he is, said, look, if you guys are making Grease, I'm in. If you're making Grease 2, I'm not.
Well, there was no 2 at the end of that title, by the way. Yes. So I guess...
That's right.
Yeah, funny.
I also, this weekend I looked at the per theater averages, because we often get mired in what are the top movies, meaning what movies earn the most in terms of the box office revenue. But often that belies a nice story within the indie world. And I'm sure, Mike and Thaddeus, in both your businesses, it's not just about blockbusters. There are a lot of really great movies out there from the indie world. And if you look at Anora's total box office, sure, it's not like it blew the doors off box office wise, but look at what it's done in terms of the Oscars, and look at what that filmmaker, going back to that, had to say about the movie theater experience, even though, and he's pushing that experience. And his movie, I think it's up to 40 million globally. I'm going to look it up here in a minute, but it's not like, again, I hate to conflate the box office with the quality of the movie, because it doesn't always match up in that way.
Well, here's something. I was talking with Alyssa Fedoroff, who runs the distribution at Neon, and I went back and I looked on Alyssa's urging. And do you know that this past weekend, we talk about what does the Academy Award for Best Picture actually mean to the gross? And there's varying degrees of it has an impact or it doesn't. I can say emphatically this one had a big impact on the movie. Sure. So the movie went out and did $1.8 million. It was the second highest weekend in the entire run of the movie, which is 21 weeks. It's the biggest weekend it had since weekend number 4. So when you think about that, you're like, that award is paying, and that's just in theatrical. Imagine what it's doing in home. Like the dividends that are being paid for that award are enormous. And big shout out to our friends on Neon, though, beyond just Anora. They're having great success with The Monkey as well, which I think crossed $2 million.
And they had Parasite, so there you go.
Right.
And, well, they had Long Legs over the summer too. They're on
Long Legs.
Yes,
I would say the studios are doing their job. I have a stat here which is interesting, so I'll ask it as a question. So I've got the number of wide release films in the first quarter of 2019, 2023, 2024, and 2025 projected, because there's still a few weeks to go. Yep. So Which of those years do you think had the most wide release films in the first quarter?
Going back how far?
19, and then I have 23, 24, and 25.
I'm going to go with, based on the way you're saying that, Thaddeus, I'm going to go 25.
It is 25. 35 wide release films in the first quarter of 2025. 29 last year in 24. 27 wide releases in first quarter 23, and 28 wide releases in 2019. So obviously the grosses don't track exactly that same pattern.
Right.
But the studios are putting out, films that they consider to be worthy of wide release. Wide release is 1,000 screens or more within the industry, so that's what wide release means.
That actually is a really interesting point, and I was having that conversation with somebody last week, and that is movie marketing has gotten much more difficult since 2017, even 2019, and that is the migration away from traditional television, which is, in the old days, the majority of your campaign was spent toward TV. If you needed a substantial amount of money to go on, what I would call appointment TV, whatever it happened to be. But because that has kind of faded away, right, and the only real place when it comes to TV that really kind of pushes the needle is when you're doing live sports or an award show, something that is in the moment that can't be recorded and watched, binge watched at a later time. It's made it much more difficult for studios and marketers to find their audience. But there are tools that make it, a little more laser precise these days. Digital targeting is something that these marketing firms are getting very good at. They can target you through a connected TV and then follow you with a digital ad. That all started with you were at they saw what you were doing at a movie theater through, something. So it's interesting that you bring that up. It is, and I guess the only other thing I would say is the barrier to entry for a wide release has become much more economically friendly. In the old days, back when, again, I had hair, you would, it was $1,500 for a print, 35 millimeter print, plus you had to ship it to the locations. You were all in for, could be close to $2,000 in some cases to get a movie on screen. Today, with digital cinema, it's a fraction of that cost.
Right.
So, that does make it so that these 1,000 print releases, don't necessarily need the P&A they once needed. Right. It's good and bad at the same time.
Right. But I want to, and that's really interesting too. And the number of movies does matter, but they're not all going to hit, right? They're not all going to succeed. And again, I want to go back to Last Breath, which I think because we're so fixated, not we, but the collective we were so fixated on huge box office numbers. That's a movie that got a great review from Lindsay Barr from the AP. She also does box office, and the hold was really strong on it. So those to me are wins, again, for the industry. And you go back to the marketing, and marketing is important, but on movies that appeal to more mature audiences, I think they do read reviews. I think that does matter. Yeah. And then, of course, Mike, you brought up Anora, and it went up like 575% this past weekend. And I've looked at the data in the past as far as Oscar nominees, Best Picture nominees. The ones that generally get the biggest bumps are the ones that haven't made $100 million yet, that heading into Oscar weekend might have been at 15 million, 10 million, 15 million, something like that. And they're able to take that Oscar buzz and run with it and get another weekend. And Honora's been available at home for weeks, or at least a couple of weeks that I know of. And people went out to the movie theater to see it as the filmmaker intended on the big screen. So that's really cool. Yeah.
No, it is you're absolutely right. It's, Last Breath is Paul. That's produced by our friend Paul Brooks, who we had on the show last year. It might be fun to have Paul come back on in the next couple of weeks and talk about Last Breath, because it's a fascinating journey of how he and his son David put that movie together. Focus came in to do a hell of a job releasing the film, to your point, and it's hanging in there. And
do you think it's an issue for our industry, or just for the narrative, that if a movie doesn't open to 100 million, it just doesn't, it's hard. Like if you talk to most people about Last Breath, although they're hearing about it and reading about it, it's not necessarily at top of mind. And Anora may not have been either, although I don't know.
I think it goes back to what Thaddeus was talking about, and that is, these movies seem to open bigger and burn faster these days. And again, it's all what goes into the soup. One of my favorite examples is, of 2023 in December when Wonka opened, $39 million. Everybody wrote that thing off. But if you looked at, and we've talked about this before ad nauseum, if you looked at the audience exit scores, and if you looked at, the playtime in December, you knew that movie was going to play well. And you knew that movie, I texted somebody over at Warner's opening weekend. I said, you've got a $200 million movie on your hand based on everything. And I think they were like, from your lips to God's ears. And at the end of the day, it was $212 million or whatever it was, because it had room to breathe. Right. And it had room to play, and it was in a great playtime.
I think it was the biggest movie of January, if I remember correctly.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So
following up on that, Mike, a little bit is, and you may or may not know the answer. I know it because I looked it up, and I love to ask questions I already know the answer to.
Right. There you go.
There was, the movie that had the biggest per theater average this weekend. I bet nobody knows what it's called. And I didn't. It has a strange title. It's a baseball movie. It was in just a few theaters. It was called
What movie was it?
EFIS.
How funny.
You know what's so funny? I saw the trailer for this.
Theaters, 2,512 per theater. It's the #1 movie on a per theater average, and it's from Music Box, and it had a higher per theater average than any of the other. I don't like to compare per theater averages on films in 2 theaters to films that are in 3,000 or, like Mickey 17. But there were other movies out there like The Visitor, Hundreds of Beavers, Unbecoming a Guinea Fowl. I mean, there's some really cool movies out there. And I think I love looking at those numbers because, again, I want to start, and I used to do this pre-pandemic. I used to do an indie film top 10 based on per theater average.
Sure.
Well, I mean, when you look at, one of our, Paul, one of our favorites that we've talked about, over and over is Becoming Led Zeppelin. And here's a movie that's approaching 10 million total box, about a rock group that hasn't recorded an album since 1978.
Right. And so, IMAX, 4.5 million of the 10 million worldwide from IMAX. And just shameless plug, I have on my YouTube channel, which has, I think, 323 subscribers. I did a video of a show and tell of all my Zeppelin memorabilia, my Gibson Les Paul guitar, and did a movie review and a box office breakdown of it. And I love Becoming Led Zeppelin, and I'm so excited. And in IMAX, I think at the end of April, we're going to have Live at Pompeii from Pink Floyd. They found film cans that were marked as something else. That's the myth anyway. And they restored the footage, the 35, I believe it was 35. I'd have to double check, but they restored the prints. That'll be in IMAX. I think IMAX for me, and I said this in my video, it's not just about that giant screen. It's about the sound. And when it comes to music, and I know we're all music aficionados.
Absolutely.
Boom, that sound quality. It's not talked about as much because we think of cinema as a visual medium, which it is, but it's also...
Well, we
should get our friends at Dolby to come to one of our podcasts as well.
Yeah,
we should do one or several podcasts about cinema technology, because I think that really is such a huge part of the movie-going experience.
I think we should get Michelle from Dolby to come on and talk about
and Dolby as well. Incredible. I mean, Ray Dolby was a genius. My dad taught me about Ray Dolby, and he came up, he invented a lot of this stuff, noise reduction and all that type of thing in early days of recording. So yeah, I would love to do that on that. It's a shout out to our industry listeners. If you're in that technology or sound realm, let's get you on here, talk about what you're presenting, what you're doing to make that movie theater experience even more awesome.
Okay, here we go. And then before we wrap up, guys, I want to tease a big event that Ticket to Ride is coming up. CinemaCon, about 3 weeks from now. Boys, Ticket to Ride Live is taking the stage at Caesar's Palace.
Whoa.
We'll
be part of the independent cinema program, the iTalk program, on Monday. Ticket to Ride Live. Thaddeus, Paul, and I will be on stage. And Paul, who's our special guest going to be?
Well, we have a couple of them, but the one I'm very excited about. But Michael O'Leary is going to be one of our guests that day, which is a huge get for us. And shows you the power of Ticket to Ride Live.
Well,
You get
and
great
Michael,
guests.
and Michael, of course, is the president and CEO of the National Association of Theater Owners. And we're also going to have with us, and I'm very excited about Colleen as well, Colleen Barstow, who is the chairman and vice president of the Independent Cinema Operators Association, ITOP, and that's going to be a really good conversation. I'm looking
Very
forward
much so.
to talking.
Very excited for both of those guests. That'll be on Monday the 31st, March 31st.
So
for those of you following along at home, and those of you
everybody clean up and shave that day.
We'll do that. We'll be clean shaven. We'll change our personalities completely.
Yeah, there you go.
Show up in tuxedos that morning.
It's always fun when we get to do a live one, though. I really enjoy those.
Yeah, I think it is cool to do that live. I like it.
And we'll have that sort of available to stream all during CinemaCon, so people who are catching up with what was said in that meeting can listen all week long while all the exhibitors are all kibitzing and talking to each other. So
And it's truly live. There will be no editing on this.
Right.
But you say that now. Well, anyway, guys, fantastic getting together with all of you as usual.
Yes.
And I leave you with 2 words this week: portfolio approach.
There you go. I like it. That's what
okay, guys.
I'm going to name my bar portfolio approach.
I like it. I like it.
That's a drink.
Right,
you should name a drink after it as well, right? The portfolio approach.
Have the paper plane.
They have the paper plane. So
paper plane is one of my favorite drinks.
We've served those at events before. Be careful; it'll get you sloshed really quick.
I like it. All right, guys, that was another great episode of Ticket to Ride. I'm Paul DeGarabedian, Senior Media Analyst for ComScore. Mike Polydor, President and CEO and Chairman of Paper Airplane Media, and Thaddeus Bouchard, President, CEO, Chairman, and Chief Marketing Officer. I'm just adding titles.
The Emperor, right?
The Emperor of all things that are grand and wonderful of screen dollars. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time at the movies.
See you later, guys. Yep.
Bye-bye.
She's got a ticket.